Hello. So this writing notes video is another video particularly for graduate students in English and the humanities. We're going to talk in this video about how to come up with a topic for a thesis or a dissertation. Now, in previous videos for graduate students, particularly the one about surviving comps, I gave the caveat that every program has different requirements and different specifications, so you want to make sure that you know exactly what your particular university, college, and or department expect from you. But generally speaking, when you're doing a master's thesis, even an undergrad thesis, or a doctoral dissertation, generally speaking, the expectation is that you produce a document that demonstrates your knowledge and ability within the field, that you utilize disciplinary conventions, and that you make a scholarly intervention of some sort. So what do those things mean? Well, when we talk about utilizing the skills of the discipline, that's obviously going to depend on what the discipline is. If you're an English major, if you're an English master's or doctoral student, whatever it is, you're going to be using the skills of literary analysis, or composition and rhetoric analysis scholarship. If you're a creative writer, you are doing something different, generally speaking. And I will at some point make a video about creative writing MFA theses. But that's not this video. The same thing if you're in history, for instance. You are using the disciplinary conventions of historiography. You are studying historical texts, and you are drawing conclusions from them. If you're in art history, or if you're in whatever discipline, over the course of your program, hopefully your undergraduate years as well as your years in the graduate program, you should be learning what the skills are for this discipline. In terms of utilizing the resources of the discipline, here you're thinking about what types of arguments are being made, what approaches do people in this discipline use? And again, this is something that you should be learning throughout the course of your undergraduate and graduate education. And then in terms of making a scholarly intervention in the field, this is perhaps the most overt and most commonly talked about, whereas the other two are really more assumed. Making a scholarly intervention basically means that you're entering the conversation about a particular subject and you're saying something new. You're saying something that hasn't been said by others, or you're putting a new twist on something. So, for instance, if in 2021 you were writing about Hamlet and you wanted to make the argument that Hamlet has an Oedipus complex, and he is fundamentally driven by the anxieties that derive from resenting his uncle for getting to have sex with his mother, etc., etc. I've got some bad news for you, because that argument has already been made repeatedly. Freud and Ernest Jones both made that argument. So that's not necessarily a scholarly intervention. If you are, for instance, writing about history, it may be difficult to say something new and unique about the American Civil War, or World War II, or the Great Depression, or whatever it is. If you're in art history, it may be difficult to find a new angle to talk about Van Gogh. So these are things that you do want to be aware of. And that's actually one thing that I would suggest thinking about in terms of choosing a topic for a thesis or a dissertation, is you want to be aware of what material has already been covered. And that's something you hopefully have a sense of from your undergrad and graduate work, but it's also probably something that's going to take a bunch more reading on your part in preparation for this. So how do you even approach figuring that out? I mean, some topics, there are centuries of writing about them. I mean, if you wanted to write about Shakespeare, for instance, people have been writing critically about Shakespeare for 400 years. I mean, there's no feasible way that you could familiarize yourself with all of that material, or even the majority of it. So what do you do? How can you figure out what kind of angle you might take? Well, one of the best ways of getting inspired for a thesis or a dissertation topic is by reading the most current materials being published. So what books on this subject have come out in the past 5 years or so? Figure out what those authors are doing, because that will tell you the kinds of things that are current. And what you want to try and do is figure out a way to enter those current conversations and to say something new. So I'll give you an example. My own master's thesis, I did a queer theory thesis, and to be honest, I didn't know very much about queer theory when I settled on this topic, and that was a bad plan. That was bad strategy. The thesis came out really well. It was a very strong thesis, but I had to teach myself basically the foundations of queer theory, which I don't recommend trying to do for a project like this. So pick something that you're already interested in and knowledgeable about, generally speaking. But what had happened with my master's thesis was I was taking an Intro to Critical Theory course with Todd McGowan at University of Vermont, and we read Heather Love's book, Feeling Backwards. I think that's the name of it. If I'm not, I apologize to Heather Love, because it was a great book. But it was a very new book at the time. It was a recently published queer theory work about negative affect and the way that it shapes queer experiences. And I was really fascinated by it. And so I made that idea, that question of shame and of negative affect, the focus of my master's thesis. So that's one approach that's really good for choosing a topic for a thesis or a dissertation. Is you take what's being written right now and you figure out, okay, what can I add to this? What can I say that's slightly different than this, that's going to push the scholarly conversation or people's thinking in a slightly new direction? So that's one of the key things. The other thing that you want always, I think, to be thinking about when you are choosing a dissertation or a thesis topic is what scholarly or critical lens or lenses you want to use. Because I know people who have started working on thesis or dissertation topics because they're interested in the content, but they don't have a good sense of what they want to say. So, for instance, I went to my master's program with a guy who was really fascinated by Harry Potter, the Harry Potter novels. He wanted to write his master's thesis about Harry Potter. He, I think, spent a good amount of time trying to figure out what he wanted to actually say beyond just, these are good books, scholars should respect them. And so that's a huge challenge. It's like, okay, you love Monet, or you love the peasants' uprising of 1381, and you really want to write about it, but you have nothing new to say about it. That's a big problem. That's going to produce a subpar thesis or dissertation. But what you can do to try and counteract that is to think about not just the content of what you want to write, but the theoretical approach that you want to take. So, I mean, especially in English, we work with a lot of different types of theory. We have queer theory, we have feminism, we have critical race theory, we have post-colonialism, adaptation studies, reception studies, postmodernism, structuralism, linguistics, etc., etc. And different disciplines have different critical lenses. Classics, for instance, right now, there are all kinds of emerging work on post-colonial classics or critical race in classics, looking at the diverse influences on Greece, Rome, the Near East, etc., etc. In history, there's postmodern historiography, there's Marxist historiography, feminist historiography. So all of these different ways of approaching a particular subject. And so what you can try and do, if you know the subject you want to write about, the particular novel, play, poem, poet, writer, whatever it is, the particular artist, the particular historical period or event, whatever it is, if you know that, you can try and figure out what scholarly angles haven't people taken in discussing that particular subject. So, is there feminist work on the South American Wars for Independence? Is there a feminist angle to the Mexican Revolution? Is there what's been said from a post-colonial perspective about no drama from Japan? Whatever it is. So if you can find a new angle to look at your topic, you can start from the topic and work toward that critical angle. And so those are the key techniques, I would argue, for choosing an effective dissertation or thesis technique. So one would be start from current scholarship. What are people saying, and what can you add to it? Or what can you say that's different or going to push the conversation? And then two, what theoretical lens or what critical angle can you apply to the subject that you're interested in to say something new, to say something unique? Because again, that's ultimately what you're expected to do in a thesis or a dissertation, is to contribute a new idea.